Coming up on Primetime Politics, selling Canada to Americans.
You know who makes some of the cleanest steel in the world? Workers in Canada.
The Prime Minister addresses the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, touting this country's green economy and critical minerals. But is Justin Trudeau overpromising on industries still in development? We'll speak to our journalist panel and get their thoughts on Harjit Sajjan and his revelation to the Immigration Committee, saying he was not checking emails when Kandahar fell. Plus, after several violent attacks across the country, what will it take to make public transit safe again? This is Primetime Politics. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. We begin in New York City, where the Prime Minister spent another day, this time around, addressing the Council on Foreign Relations. For Justin Trudeau, it was a chance to build on the momentum of Joe Biden's Ottawa visit and to sell Canada as a reliable partner with products and resources to offer to a world in transition towards a greener economy.
The lithium produced in Canada is going to be more expensive because we don't use slave labor, because we put forward environmental responsibility as something we actually expect to be abided by, because we count on working with, in partnership with Indigenous peoples, paying fair living wages and expecting security and safety standards. The world needs to decide, and are still in the process of deciding, is whether or not we're actually going to value the things we value throughout our supply chains.
Well, to talk about the Prime Minister's address, we're now joined by this week's journalists panel. Tonda MacCharles is the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star. Stephanie Taylor is a reporter with the Canadian Presse. And Joël-Denis Bellavance is the Ottawa Bureau Chief for La Presse. Hello to the three of you.
Hey there.
Good to see you. So here we have the Prime Minister in New York, as we say, really pushing Canada's environmental credentials, critical minerals, a clean electricity grid. And that is what the government is hoping to achieve, and I take that. But, I wonder, when you talk about critical minerals, when you talk about the clean energy grid, there's still a lot of work to be done on both in order to achieve the government targets.
Massive.
Massive. So is the government, is the Prime Minister putting the cart before the horse, trying to sell this to New York?
Well, look, let's say it's aspirational. It's an aspirational agenda on all of those fronts. The government is prepared to put a lot of money in it, but even its own timelines to achieve that kind of successful investment in those areas and development of critical minerals industry in this country is, again, but worth $80 billion over the next 11 years, right? So he's down there selling it, and yes, a little bit putting the cart before the horse, because some of those projects, some of the areas they want to develop are long-term projects where they haven't got the infrastructure even to get these critical minerals out of the ground and onto a rail car or a truck or a ship and out of Northern Ontario, for example, where Ring of Fire encompasses a lot of those mineral developments. So yeah, it's aspirational, is what ambitious, but we're not there yet.
Yeah. You say Ring of Fire, and I have a thought on that. But first, I want to talk to you, Joël-Denis, because again, here's the Prime Minister selling these industries, these resources that we've yet to really figure out how that's going to work. Is there a fear of disappointing our partners in this?
Well, there is, because the government is known for not approving projects very quickly, and that's one of the main criticisms that have been addressed to the government. But I think Mr. Trudeau is still doing something sort of a selling job, selling Canada to the rest of the world, and reminding all those investors that Canada does exist, because I was told that nobody wakes up in the morning outside of Canada thinking of Canada, and so you have to remind them every time that Canada exists, and for the right reason, for our environment policies, for clean energy, but also access to critical minerals. And there's a race right now around the globe for investment in this area, so you have to make sure that Canada raises its hand and said, we do exist and we have lots of that, so come and invest in Canada. So it's part of the job of selling, but there's an obligation of results on the part of the government to approve projects quickly. And a lot of the ministers who are in charge of economic portfolios are aware of that. Christophe Freeland, the finance minister, is aware of that. Jonathan Wilkinson as well, and François-Philippe Champagne. And they work together in a semi-formal way, if I may say, to try to make sure that we get to approve those projects for critical mineral in a more rapid manner.
Yeah. Stephanie, what do you think of the challenge versus what essentially is the sell job in New York right now?
I mean, Jonathan Wilkinson has acknowledged it takes too long to actually get a mine up and running in this country, at least a decade. Yeah. So as you say, this is very aspirational, and there's still a lot more homework that needs to be done. I think this announcement, it's very clearly Trudeau is still riding the victory lap off of landing the Volkswagen deal. But experts from Canada, elsewhere, the United States, all agree that the government has to answer the regulatory questions of not just approvals, but actually getting it built. And talking about the Ring of Fire, yes, some First Nations are in favor of it, but some First Nations are not in favor of it. And this is a government that also values reconciliation, and it has since day one, and it says it continues to. So how is it going to accomplish that? And it's frankly not even a problem. I mean, it's a problem because the Liberals are in power, but any government in Canada is going to have to contend with this and contend with potential court cases. And how are investors going to deal with that when they've looked at what happened with Trans Mountain Pipeline the last time a project tried to get built and it was tied in court and the government had to step in? So there's a lot more homework the government needs to do after it's done its victory lap.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you both mentioned the Ring of Fire, and quite frankly, we've been talking about the Ring of Fire in some form for so long now, for decades at this point.
30 years?
Exactly. And to your point, there's not even a road to get up there at this moment in time. So talk to me about what you're hearing amongst Ottawa officials, amongst ministers and government people about that challenge and how they intend to tackle it.
Well, I've asked that question of Minister Wilkinson and talked to him about that, but I don't hear actually a concerted plan, and maybe they have one and they're not telling us. There's lots of times when they've got work behind the scenes going on, they don't tell us. They don't see fit to let Canadians in on, for example, their strategy of how to secure the Volkswagen investment until, bang, they drop it on the table that day. I can only assume that both the provincial government and the federal government are doing some kind of outreach work with the various Indigenous communities and leaders in those areas. But, you know, Bob Rae, when he left as interim Liberal leader before he was appointed to the embassy in New York, or the mission to the UN in New York, was involved very much in trying to push that development along and the talks and the consultations with the Indigenous leaders there. But the last time I talked to leaders up in that area, there was still no sense of urgency around talking to them and compelling talks forward. But you know, to be honest, that was a little while ago, so I don't know where it stands now. But it can't move forward unless they're engaged.
Yeah, the Premier of Ontario has been pushing a little bit more lately because of the Volkswagen announcement, and also that Canada wants to be able to build electric car from the batteries up, you know, assembling it. And so he's been pushing it. And the fact that he's got a great working relationship with Mr. Trudeau probably will get more attention from Ottawa. But I would say that on Ottawa's radar, it's been far away. They've been dealing with other issues. And there's also some dilemma facing the government because there is an environment minister named Stephen Guilbeault, who is, you know, his reputation is at stake on many fronts because of economic development, but also decisions that may affect the environment. And on this front, he may be, you know, more reluctant to, be on board on that decision.
Okay, well, listen, let's leave this topic right now. Let's leave Justin Trudeau in New York, move on to Alexandre Trudeau back here in Canada, because Alexandre Trudeau is making news as well. He apparently wants to testify next week so that he can defend the foundation that bears his father's name. But this week, we're hearing from Pascale Fournier. She is a past president of the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation, and she says past officials misled the Canadian public because of identifying that $140,000 donation as coming from business, rather not identifying it as a donation coming from businessmen from China. It was rather identified as a Canadian donation. Take a listen.
I immediately started to ask questions about, why is it that we would have two receipts that are so different, that one seems to be international with money that seems to come from China, and another one with an address in Quebec. And I looked with the CFO, Caroline Lynn, who was working with me on that file. We tried to understand what was sent to the government.
Okay, Stephanie, I'll get you to start us out here. How troubling is it to see a recent president essentially distance herself from the foundation with which she was working?
This is a foundation that is in damage control. They are in crisis. And I think for any Canadian that is following this story, and I think it's worth saying, it's a confusing story. There's lots of twists and turns, and to keep up with it. And if you're not from Ontario or Quebec, you might not even know what the Trudeau Foundation is or what it really does, that it offers scholarships. But I think any Canadian watching this testimony, if there were watching testimony today, they're seeing a lot of finger pointing, and they're seeing a lot of how is this going to be solved and who is responsible, and again, that kind of damage control. So it's after this testimony, it is hard to see how things are getting any better for the foundation, as it still tries to, as you say, with Mr. Trudeau wanting to appear, kind of salvage that reputation, where it still finds itself in this political epicenter of a fight of who knew what, when, and where.
Well, I mean, I think to a certain extent, what Alexandre Trudeau wants to testify about is the kind of good work the foundation does and salvage its reputation. But that's almost beside the point right now to the political debate over, you know, the source of the money. Was there a deliberate effort to identify it or not misidentify it and not reveal its actual origins? And to what extent people were misled around that. And so that's the political question. And honestly, I'm not sure if Alexandre Trudeau is going to shed light on that, or if he's going to find himself sort of at the crosshairs of an attack on he and his brother and his family name and how he rises to that.
Well, I got to say as well. Well, you know, it baited, but he also said, he said this in a newspaper article, right? In an interview.
Not in La Presse, unfortunately.
which is why I'm staring at you. But regardless, great paper. So he essentially says that he wants to testify. I don't know if he realized, or he realized it would be the ethics committee that would reach out and say, yeah, come speak with us, because a far different committee than the procedures committee.
Chaired by the Conservatives.
Absolutely, the key part of that. So what do you make of all that?
Well, it's Pascal Fournier, I think, pointed out an issue of governance and proper governance in the face of the public, its accountability towards the National Revenue Agency, and also the main provider of fund, innovation, industry, and science department. Mr. Trudeau, the Alexandre Trudeau, might be on the hot seat because he's the one who signed the contract for the donation with, you know, whoever signed it on the other end of it, so we don't know. So he's the one who signed it, and Pascal Fournier was saying that he did not have the authority to sign that. So that may bring a lot of questions at that committee, and I'm sure that, yes, he's ready to testify, but he should be ready to face some tough questions on the part of the Bloc Québécois, the Conservative, and the NDP as well.
Yeah, if he still shows up, because I think that's the other thing we have to watch out for.
But they will compel his appearance. And so, I mean, there's now that he's already offered to, it's going to be pretty hard for him to sidestep that.
One point that I think is worth mentioning is that his testimony will be on the eve of the Liberal Convention in Ottawa. So will that drag the bad publicity until the convention? That remains to be seen, but there's a danger there.
Yeah, we're watching, and of course, luckily for us, we're covering the convention as well. But listen, before we're completely out of time, I want to move on to another topic, Harjit Sajjan, because he did give testimony this week to the Commons Immigration Committee, and that committee had questions about travel documents that were issued to Afghans trying to come to Canada during the fall of Kandahar. Now, they were not issued by the regular officials. Instead, it was issued by Senator Marilu McFedrin. And Minister Sajjan, who was Defense Minister at the time, says he was not aware this was happening because he was not checking his emails. Take a listen.
Do you personally monitor your personal parliamentary email account, otherwise known as the P9s?
Yes, I do.
Did you monitor that account between August and September 2021?
I can tell you that time I was not looking at emails during
So you did not monitor your personal email account
at that time,
between August and September 2021?
Madam Chair, if I can answer the whole question. That time the situation was so dire that we had to stay focused, and the communication at that time was done very quickly. I had no time right now to be looking at emails. I was focused on the briefings, which is...
Okay, so he says given the crisis at the moment, he had no time to check the emails. What do you make of that?
That sounds pretty much like a lame excuse, not looking at your personal emails. You know, that's the first thing that I check in the morning, and I'm assuming a cabinet minister having his responsibility would do the utmost to check his personal emails at a time of crisis, because the Prime Minister probably could send him an email on his P9. So Would that mean they wouldn't read those emails? It just shows that Mr. Sajjan is, again, in trouble.
Let's explain to people, though, even the context here. It was, he's right, it was a chaotic time. It was chaotic because the government had failed to foresee the fall of the Taliban and the need to evacuate people out of Afghanistan, not just Canadians.
And they were calling an election that day.
And they called the election, well, they scrambled 2 days ahead of the election to do some measures to help, and then they called the election. And then for the first 10 days of that campaign, if you'll remember, it was dominated by Afghanistan. And so for the minister in charge of the evacuation not to be reading emails is a dereliction of duty. But even if he were reading his emails or weren't reading his emails, he had a chief of staff, he had a deputy minister, he had people advising him. And it turns out, as we've reported, his chief of staff was involved in facilitating the exit of some people out of Afghanistan by providing letters, exit letters, travel facilitation letters that he got from a global affairs political colleague. So what's going on? This whole story raises not just legal questions of whether or not it is a valid letter and that Canada should honor it in some respect to those Afghans who were left behind, or some that got out and remained in Albania. I reported this week it was FIFA was trying to help women's soccer players out of Afghanistan. Some of them are still stranded. Some of them are in Afghanistan. Some are still stranded in Albania and other countries. Michelle Rempel-Garner's got a family who she's trying to help, who got one of these letters. We don't know how, but that family got one of those letters, and they only made it to the U.S. So there's legal questions around what does Canada owe these people, given the source of these letters, and then there are political and moral questions. What is our obligation, even if they're deemed not to be official government documents, as the government is claiming? They're identical to the official documents that were being handed out by Immigration and Global Affairs. So it's a problem, and it's a problem going forward because actually, you know, the senator was acting in good faith, but really, is that the senator's role as well? So there are many, many questions around.
Yeah, well, and I think one of the questions also has to be, what is the future of Harjit Sajjan in cabinet?
He was appointed back in cabinet after the 2021 election, and we remember up until then, he was in charge of national defense as it handled, headline after headline about mishandled, sexual misconduct allegations. And there were questions then, and he found himself back in cabinet. To Tonda's point, ministers are busy people, but that is why they have staff. That is why they have offices. That is why they have infrastructure and resources. And there is an expectation when you are appointed to cabinet to stay on top of your files, whether that's checking your emails, your texts, whatever it may be. And this does raise questions going back to that election where, as you say, Trudeau was hammered for almost 10 days straight at the start of the campaign of how can you be doing this? How can you say you're on top of the evacuation from Afghanistan while also campaigning for re-election? And the fact that the minister is saying I was too busy to check emails bubbles up those questions again of how seriously was Canada impeded in any way, shape, or form because it was distracted by an election campaign. Now, the Liberals have obviously said that's not the case, but this kind of brings all of those questions bubbling back up. And it does bring those questions up about this minister, but we've seen this songbook with him before. Okay.
Well, we watch closely, and sadly we're out of time, but really appreciate the discussion. Tonda MacCharles with the Toronto Star, Stephanie Taylor with Canadian Presse, and Joël-Denis Bellavance with the great paper La Presse. Thank you for the time.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Over the past few months, we have witnessed violent attacks on public transit, not in just one city, but several right across the country. It is shaking the sense of security in transit workers when they show up for their shifts and has many people questioning their own safety when they board a bus or a train. So what can be done about the situation? Earlier this week, I spoke with Marco D'Angelo, the president and the CEO of the Canadian Urban Transit Association. So, you know, the timing of your media event certainly has resonance. We've just seen a number of really horrific attacks on transit systems across this country. Before we actually get to the recommendations themselves, talk to me about what you've heard about the impact of these kinds of attacks from transit workers, but also from transit users.
Well, I mean, at the beginning of the pandemic, we were able to secure funding to ensure that we had a high level of service so that Canada's essential workers could get to their jobs during the pandemic. Since that's is subsiding, ridership began to increase. And right now we're at about 70 to 75% of ridership on average returning across Canada. What we don't want to have is fear of taking transit being an impediment for folks returning to transit and taking our services so they can get around their cities.
It's what you don't want to have happen, but do you sense that's already happening right now?
Well, it's undeniable. In many large cities, there have been incidents of violence in transit, and that's why our association worked with 7 large systems across Canada to develop a series of recommendations that we think are actionable and doable and will make our transit systems more secure for folks.
Okay, now the recommendations, they involve action on the municipal level, on the provincial level, on the federal level. Obviously, you're making an appeal to Ottawa today, so let's begin there. In terms of the federal ask, one of them has to do with a criminal code redefinition. Can you talk to us about that?
Sure. Our association, maybe about a decade ago almost, we started a campaign to amend Section 269 of the Criminal Code. And so at that time, transit operators were included as a protected group, so when it comes to sentencing, that would be considered a factor when a judge would determine the sentence for assault. And what we're asking for today is to have that definition broadened to include all of those who work in transit, because it goes beyond operators. We've got maintenance and supervisors and cleaners and customer service people, and we need to make sure that they are protected. We have to provide a safe workplace for our employees across the country.
Okay, so one has to do with the criminal code adjustment, but among the other recommendations, I guess a couple of them that goes to the provinces really, or it seems just on the surface, is the fact that you note that transit is also, beyond getting people from A to B, being used by others as a way to solve homelessness for some, as a place of refuge for those who are experiencing mental health crisis, mental health issues. Where does the federal government fit into that piece for you?
Well, I think that the federal government certainly can lend support, as well as the provinces, in making sure that there's 24-hour access for those that are experiencing mental health issues or addiction issues. We don't think that transit is the right place for people to spend their nights, but we know that it has been a reality in cities, and it's been exacerbated in recent months. And we feel that the provinces can step up to help to ensure that our transit facilities are safe and to connect those people with housing or with lodging for overnight purposes. Also during heat waves to heating to cooling centers, and during we had some cold snaps this winter as well, that there's a role for provinces to play to help to fund ways to house those that need a place to sleep. And all too often they have found public transit to be that realm, and our recommendations, I think, begin to address that issue.
And that goes to safety for you?
Indeed, we have to have safety for our riders, safety for our customers. It's our duty, and we've been very proud of our record over these many years. But we have a unique challenge in different cities with illegal drug use, with crimes of assault that are taking place, and we have a mental health system across Canada that doesn't seem to be able to help enough. And transit is a point of last resort for too many people, and we need to address that.
Mm-hmm. Now, a part of this also goes towards security, more empowerment for transit constables. But you're also calling for a meeting of provincial, federal, and municipal leaders to come together to actually tackle this. How far along is that request? What type of response have you had so far?
Well, we've worked with those cities that are most affected by the outbreak of violence during the last couple of months. But also we've reached out to Labour and happy to have their support on these recommendations. We've met with mayors, and now we are going to come to the table, and we invite our federal and provincial transportation ministerial counterparts to meet with us to help us to find actionable, affordable, and solutions that can happen in the near term so that people can get around their communities without fear for their personal safety.
And what type of timeline do you hope accomplishes this?
Well, I mean, we've got the report out today. We know, not all 27 recommendations can happen overnight, but it's definitely been a conversation starter. And we're very interested in following up on these recommendations with the provinces and with the federal government on them.
Marco D'Angelo, thank you very much for the time.
Okay, thank you very much.
If Mona Forte can say that our offer is unreasonable, trying to keep our members who make $40,000 to $65,000 a year, if she's saying that that's not affordable, how the heck does she expect those workers to continue to live and to keep up with the rate of inflation?
Well, that is the message from the PSAC President Chris Aylward to the Treasury Board President as striking public servants came together on Parliament Hill earlier this week. Now, Aylward says the government is stalling and he wants the Prime Minister to tell Mona Forte to bring in a higher wage offer. Forte says the government remains at the table, but she also calls union demands unaffordable and unreasonable. The strike by more than 100,000 public servants is now closing out its second week. And with more on the story and the other political developments of the week, let's bring in our political strategists. Greg MacEachern is an Ottawa-based consultant and former Liberal strategist. Kate Harrison is the vice chair of Summa Strategies. And Kim Wright is the principal with Wright Strategies. Good to see all three of you.
Hello.
Listen, I want to begin here with the Public Service Alliance strike, obviously now dragging out into a second week. And there are a few issues holding up negotiations, among them salaries, perhaps not surprisingly. The union does say that they dropped their demands from the last one we heard, so down from the 13.5% over 3 years. But the government seems to be holding very fast to its 9% offer. Greg, why is the government playing hardball here?
I'm not sure it's as much hardball as just basic negotiations, but there is the reality that we have to pay for the pandemic. And I'm sure that the government is keeping an eye on everything that they've committed to, whether it's, the healthcare deals with the provinces or this. There's also a bit of a feeling that this is an air war. The president of the Treasury Board, Mona Forte, has started communicating through open letters. So kind of going over the heads of the union directly to the public and to union members. And what's interesting is I noticed last weekend that the rhetoric really changed. It got a lot tougher from the union, very personal when it came to Forte. And perhaps it's a coincidence, but that came right after some media reports that the number of union members that actually voted was pretty low by Canadian standards. So it does feel like there's an air war going on. And from what I saw today at the press conference, it felt like the union leadership was still talking to their membership. So, as someone based in Ottawa, when I listen to local radio, I read local news, you're hearing from union members who are still a bit uncomfortable that they're on strike and that they know that the public hasn't yet kind of joined their cause. I think people can understand some of the wages seem pretty low when in an expensive city like Ottawa, for example. But in terms of the work from home, a lot of people in the private sector were given those instructions back in November. So I still feel like the federal government understands that the public might not be completely on side with the union, and they have that as part of their negotiating tools.
Mm-hmm. Now, PSAC, and I'll bring you, Kate, into this. They do argue that when they talk about a salary increase, they just really don't want to fall behind the cost of living, and they point to the fact that CEOs did get bonuses through the pandemic. Government's bottom lines across the country increased thanks to inflation. What do you make of the union demand? As I said, they just want to keep up with the cost of living.
Yeah, I understand that to a point, and I think that that's why there is rightly the argument for some correction. But we don't often see the reverse argument, of course, which is when inflation is low, salaries decrease. So there needs to be a little bit of understanding that we are in an exceptional time. Inflation has it perhaps leveled off for a period of time, but we still see PSAC negotiating for an exorbitantly high rate. I think Greg made a really important point, which is that from the outside, these are good paying jobs. There was quite a bit of flexibility during the pandemic to work from home. We didn't see paychecks clawed back as a result of the nature of work shifting or when government services were inaccessible. These people still got paid, and that's all well and good. But when you're on the outside now looking at the complaints being leveled from PSAC, I just don't think it lines up with where the public sentiment is at right now. Things might change if service delivery starts being massively disrupted, if we see disruption at borders, for instance, or when people are traveling, the delays in passports, et cetera. That's when the government will start feeling more pain.
Mm-hmm. Kim, I want to bring you in, but people, we've heard both Greg and Kate reference public sentiment, but there was this poll that came out today from Angus Reid, and it says Canadians are actually supportive of many union demands, with 55% of Canadians agreeing that federal employees do have a right to work from home. What do you make of the negotiations so far?
Yeah, the government switched over to air war because they took a playbook out of Doug Ford and said, look, let's just talk about wages and make them vilified of being these high paid workers, as opposed to the range of workers, the people who help fill out your passports and they do the government services. It's really also an interesting pivot because you also saw the government of Canada somehow being able to come up with $13 billion for a private company called Volkswagen to come in and invest in a town, which frankly, there's a lot of electric vehicle charging infrastructure companies in Canada that would have liked those kind of resources, let alone the public service who could then get those raises that they've been asking for because there would have been that money in there. But the Prime Minister chose to, take a playbook out of, corporate welfare bums and give that kind of money out. It wasn't necessary, but now they're trying to pivot away and call PSAC members, well, good public servants, a bit lazy, and maybe they should come out of their homes and come back to work. The reality is we all need you. Every business that's listening and that is watching this is saying, okay, we need to rethink how we do some work from home. How do we do job shadowing? How do we do job training? And the government becomes a bit of a test case for that. But the reality is there's lots of money within the federal government. There are lots of programs they could allocate to making sure that that these workers are taken care of. They've chosen to go into a public battle because they think that's the way to get people to cave on this. And the reality is that you just need to treat your workers fairly. And as always, a negotiated settlement is always the best settlement, not only in the workplace, but for taxpayers as well.
Okay. So we'll keep watching negotiations, but I'm quickly running out of time. I do want to ask about Sudan before we're done today. As you know, at this point, the government has evacuated dozens of Canadian nationals from Sudan. Hundreds more are calling for help. A minute to each of you here. What more, if anything, can the government do to address the situation? Greg?
I think continuing to do what they're doing right now, which is working with our partners, trying to find angles in collaborating with other countries. I did a quick check, Michael. The Economist in early January mentioned that there was some economic strife in Sudan, but this, I think, took a lot of people by surprise in mid-April. So I think, Canada, for the country the size we are, I think we're doing our level best.
Kate, what would you say to the matter?
Yeah, there's a certain level of readiness that Canada just has been not able to achieve on matters like this for years now. It reminds me a little bit of the situation we saw in Afghanistan and the disorganization that occurred there. I mean, we have to continue to make sure we've got a good relationship with allies because they continue to be the ones to bail us out of these really uncomfortable circumstances. Germany and others stepped up and have been putting a number of Canadians on their aircraft. But it does draw attention, Michael, to the need to better resource, rescue military defense efforts, and that is a slow-moving process.
Kim?
Absolutely. What we remember from those images out of Kandahar were children being separated from their parents, people having to go to internet cafes that had the paperwork that had maple leafs on them to try to fill out paperwork. And surprise, surprise, the Taliban got a little grumpy about that. How do we not have a readiness model? What is our intelligence community not doing to flag this? Or does the minister just sit on these reports like they have so many others? And at the end of the day, Canada has this great reputation in their humanitarian efforts, but when push comes to shove, somehow we always seem to step in the paperwork, and that has to change because there is going to be more Sudans, there are going to be more Kandahars, there are more problems in the global community that Canada just seems to be ill prepared to deal with.
Okay, well, always good to get your thoughts on the matter. Greg, Kate, and Kim, thank you for the time. And I swear, before the season's through, I'm just going to have a whole half hour with the three of you because there is never enough time. But thank you for today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Officials continue to evacuate Canadian nationals out of Sudan, trapped by fighting between the country's army and a paramilitary group known as the Rapid Support Forces, or the RSF. It is a bloody struggle that has left hundreds dead since fighting broke out earlier this month. And to discuss the situation, I did speak this week with Nicholas Coghlan. Mr. Coghlan served as the sole diplomatic presence in Sudan from 2000 to 2003, and he was also Canada's first ambassador to South Sudan from 2012 to 2013. During that time, he helped save hundreds of lives by staying behind and evacuating Canadian citizens who were trapped when South Sudan descended into chaos. Ambassador, thank you for joining us.
Most welcome. Thank you for the invitation.
Now, Global Affairs says there are about 1,500 Canadians in Sudan right now. And like many foreign nationals, there are those who want to get out of the country. But Canada has temporarily suspended operations in the capital of Khartoum. What kind of help can these Canadians get if consular officials are now operating in another country?
Well, there's no question that assistance is going to be more limited than it would have been had they been on the ground. What they can be doing, of course, is collating information from all of our allies about what is going on, feeding that information back into Sudan so that people on the ground get a better idea of the context. But most importantly, of course, trying to coordinate with our allies, evacuation flights, and as and when those flights materialize, getting the information back to the individuals in Sudan of where they need to be and when to get on board and with what documentation and so on. So they can do a fair amount, but no question they would be more effective on the ground.
Mm-hmm. I want to touch on both of those in a moment, but as I said earlier, you did stay behind in South Sudan back in 2013. Your efforts and those of your wife saved hundreds of lives. What kind of help were you able to provide Canadians who actually showed up at the airport, that physical presence versus being in another country?
Well, I'd like very much to stress that these things are, a team effort. Although it was, in the end, it was just my wife and myself in Juba, we did have dozens, possibly hundreds of people backing us up, both in the region and in Ottawa. I mean, I'll give you a little example here. So on a daily basis, we would basically tune into Ottawa, to the crisis group, who would tell us how during the night, what flights they had arranged and how many seats we were going to get, what time the planes were coming in and so on. We would then go down to the airport, put up our flag in the tree, and we would be calling in obviously the correct number of Canadians, if we'd had 20 seats or 30 seats or whatever, and then process them. I'll give you a little example of why you need the presence on the ground. About the third or fourth day of the evacuation, when things were pretty bad in Juba, we had a middle-aged gentleman showed up, obviously quite distressed. He was basically in shorts and a pair of flip-flops and a little plastic bag with his possessions and his 7-year-old daughter by his hand. He had his passport. He had not had time to get the daughter's passport. His neighbor had his throat cut in front of him, and he had been told to get out now. So there he was at the airport. He's got a passport, the daughter hasn't. Now, I have the authority to issue an emergency passport, but I have to be satisfied that person is a Canadian. So there you have an example. What that requires is getting back to Ottawa. I had a very good team back at headquarters, passport office in the middle of the night in Ottawa, run through it. In the end, all credit to them. Basically, they say to me, there's nothing else to be done here. Look at the father, look at the girl, and tell me if you think they are a father and daughter. So on that basis, we're able to issue the passport, get them on the plane, and get them out. Obviously, that is something you can't be doing remotely.
So does it make sense then, given the amount of desperation right now, if you translate that past experience with what's happening right now in Sudan, so many Canadians wanting to get out, does it make sense to suspend operations then?
Well, I mean, you have, what is being put into practice here. Well, we haven't yet seen it. We haven't seen a Canadian aircraft going in with Canadian personnel. But the alternative to that modus operandi is to send your plane in with your consular officials on board. Obviously, you need to know that the airport is secure. You're depending on your allies. You're depending on people on the ground to know you have a secure location. You come in, your consular crew all disembark. You process your people on the ground, then you all leave together. The disadvantages of that, it takes a lot more time. You're going to have the aircraft on the ground for several hours. Also, those Canadian officials coming in are taking up seats that could be used for going out. And similarly, you don't have the same sense of what is going on. One of our routines in Juba, a daily routine, would be meeting with all of the other embassies. Now, you might rightly say in Sudan, there are no other embassies right now. So that's a huge limitation. But with non-governmental organizations, UN, whatever, to get a feeling of what is happening in the city, which are the safe zones, which are the more dangerous zones, and then so that we can operate the next day. A further thing we were able to do in Juba in South Sudan was when we had people stranded in the city, make contact with them, and we would go out in the armored vehicle to pick them up and bring them into the airport if they felt they were unable to do that. Having said that, in Sudan, I have no question it's a much larger scale and also operating at a greater distance. The airport they're using is 20 or 30 kilometers out of town.
So huge challenges. As I said, Global Affairs says there are about 1,500 Canadians right now in Sudan. By all accounts, that seems to be an undercount. What do you make of that?
Almost certainly an undercount. I mean, just to give you an example, in Juba at the beginning of the crisis, basically I was ordered to evacuate, and I was told, well, what about the Canadians? And they said that, listen, there only are 17 on the list. And I knew that was not possible. I'd been processing 3 or 4 passports a week for a year. And in fact, in the first week, we evacuated 140. There are a lot of reasons why people don't register, principally because they are usually dual nationals. They feel at home. They feel as though they're in their own country. They feel comfortable. Why would I bother registering? And there are some others who fail to register simply because they distrust the bureaucracy. They feel this could be some approach by Canada Revenue or something like that. So the numbers who register is always a significant underestimate. But having said that, of those 1,500, not all will wish to be evacuated.
Now, as you noted, the Prime Minister says that Canada will be using a military transport plane to airlift citizens out of Sudan. But there's been no ceasefire that's held so far to allow a safe landing of a plane. How hopeful are you that an evacuation might be near? Do you have much faith in that plan?
I mean, I don't have the inside track on what's happening here. A number of countries have made successful evacuations. As I said, the airstrip they're using is definitely in a more secure location. It's not in the middle of the fighting. Khartoum Airport itself is right in the center of the fighting, even though it's very convenient to be able to get to. So one has some hope it might hold. I think the medium to long-term perspective is not good. You have basically, it's an all-out power struggle between these 2 armed groups, the leaders of which, both of whom, frankly, are war criminals who deserve prosecution. The only reason they have not been sanctioned is because right now you need somebody to talk to. But they are not to be trusted, and of course their command and control is probably limited. A lot of their troops are not being fed, not being watered, so they are looting, they are on the rampage as well. And so it is a fairly bleak scenario, I would say.
Nicholas Coghlan, really appreciate the time and your insight into this matter.
Thank you for the invitation.
One of their own to the moon. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Well, you're looking at the scene from a few weeks ago. The Industry Minister, François-Philippe Champagne, at the Johnson Space Center in Houston as NASA announced the crew for Artemis 2. It will be the first crewed mission to the moon in decades, and on board will be Canadian astronaut Jeremy Hansen. Now, that upcoming mission was celebrated in Ottawa this week, and to talk about it a bit more, I spoke with former Premier of New Brunswick and now the CEO of the industry group Space Canada, Brian Gallant. Now, as we talk about the celebrations this evening, you are joined in Ottawa today by the crew of Artemis 2, the Prime Minister, the Industry Minister, experts, students. What does Canada's participation in the Artemis program mean for the future of the space industry in this country?
It's an extremely exciting day. It's an extremely exciting time for the Canadian space sector. I would also argue for Canada as a whole, and even for all of humanity. I mean, with Artemis 2, humanity is venturing out into space yet again. The Canadian Space Agency astronaut Jeremy Hansen will be a part of the 4-person crew of Artemis 2, which is a big deal. It's a big deal to the point that the Prime Minister wants to be involved and meet the astronauts. And I wonder if it's because, in part, he recognizes the monumental historic nature of this mission. I wonder if it's because, obviously, he recognizes, I hope, the importance of space to our everyday lives as Canadians and for people around the globe. But I also like to think he just is interested by space. I mean, he is inspired by it. And to see 4 astronauts come together to be able to accomplish what they're going to accomplish is pretty amazing. So for the Canadian space ecosystem and industry, we really hope that the Artemis 2 mission helps to instill a sense of pride for Canadians. We hope it raises awareness of the importance of space to our everyday lives, how it can help our economy, how it can help us tackle societal and planetary challenges that worry us. And you know what? I hope it inspires a new generation of Canadians to reach for the stars.
Yeah, let's build
figuratively, but almost literally in this case.
Yeah, well, listen, let's build on a few of those points, though, because if you don't mind, back in 2019, the space industry employed over 10,000 Canadians. It generated nearly $5.5 billion in revenues. It was mostly in satellite and broadcasting services, though. Where else might the space industry go with this type of program, now a part of its history and future?
Yeah, you're right. Billions of dollars per year that it contributes to Canada's economy, thousands of jobs that it produces. And what's really important to note is that it's poised to grow. There are reports that says it'll get to hundreds of billions of dollars in the next few decades, even some that will say that it will come to $1 trillion a year by 2040. So this is an immense sector with lots of growth opportunities. And there's lots of areas in which Canada can benefit from this: Earth observation, remote sensing. And also people should all kind of try to wrap their heads around the idea that yeah, there's the direct benefits of investing in space, but what space also helps us do is be all that much more competitive. If we want to have smart cities, autonomous cars, robotic manufacturing, AI, the metaverse, these things are going to be enabled by space infrastructure. And the competitiveness of many emerging and traditional industries in Canada will, in fact, depend on space development and innovation.
Mm-hmm. In fact, as you list all those things, obviously the industries of the future, if Canada wants to remain competitive. So as you talk about all of that, Mr. Gallant, where does government investment fit into this, or are things shifting? Because we are certainly seeing more private players entering the space race. I'm thinking about Blue Origin and SpaceX. What's the picture like here in Canada, government versus private investment?
Yeah, it's the question, really. And why it's the question is decades ago, any country that was doing something into space, when we kind of first started, it really was led by governments. It was government programming. And government plays an immense role for the space industry today. There's no question about that. But it has changed. And to your point, there's a commercialization of space now in the sense that space is more accessible. What we can harness in terms of the benefits of space for humanity and for Canadians, for economic growth, has changed and morphed over the years. So because of that, the dynamic has changed with it. So governments have a very important role, and they should invest more into space given the economic opportunities that I listed off, but also because space can help us tackle climate change. The World Meteorological Organization says that the variables that we need to monitor to fight and mitigate climate change, well, 50% of them are going to be monitored through space. It can help with the digital divide, helping give economic opportunity to communities and families here in Canada and remote, rural, Indigenous, and northern communities. So there's a lot of reasons why we should be investing as a country. But then also government can play a role in helping industry, helping the ecosystem be able to invest and create opportunities for Canadians while tackling these societal challenges. So it's a very interesting time. We hope today's mission will shed light on the interesting dynamics that have been created, but also, again, just be a celebration of this wonderful feat that these 4 individuals will do on behalf of humanity. And it's great to have a Canadian be a part of it.
Well, Brian Gallant, I wish I was at the reception this evening, but I'm here working. Still, thank you for the time. Appreciate it. Thank you for being with us this evening.
Well, thank you. And it is going to be an out-of-this-world event. Right? I just had to say it.
Okay, send pictures. Brian Gallant, the CEO of Space Canada. Senator Michelle Odette was given a distinct honor on Wednesday, presented the 4 millionth moose hide campaign pin. Now, this is in recognition of her work fighting and raising awareness about gender-based violence, both before and during her time as senator. The Moose Hide campaign is an Indigenous grassroots organization, and to tell us a bit more about them and the honor given to her, we are now joined by Senator Michelle Odette. Senator, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
So I want to begin with your reaction to be presented again the 4 millionth pin of the Moose Hide campaign. How significant is that for you?
Well, it was huge. It started when we received the invitation or the request, and I was like, it is big. But it was this morning when I was in the same room of, people, grassroots people, family, and the daughters of Monsieur Lacerte, and I presume it was a little square, like we see since the beginning of this campaign, but it was a huge, beautiful beading with the symbol of the moose on it, and it became very, very, very obvious for me that ceremony, powerful, and the responsibility that I have to carry until I don't breathe, I would say.
Well, let's talk a bit about both, beginning with the Moose Hide campaign. As I said right off the beginning, this is an Indigenous grassroots-led organization. What sets it apart for you?
Well, it tells the rest of Canada that for too long, I would say, that we denounce and still today denounce that it's something we're facing every day, but also we come with solution. We come with place where we want to mobilize Canadian people, no matter where you're from or where you live, that you can be part of the solution. And the beauty also is that for us, we believe as Indigenous women, where I'm coming from, that men are part of the solution and they could do something. So a dad who spoke to his daughter when they went moose hunting, they decide together to do this initiative, and where men stand beside us, not for us, beside us. And that, for me, it's very powerful.
Yeah, tackling gender violence by having the participation of men and boys. Now, but the statistics around gender-based violence in this country, you talk about your lifetime work, the responsibility that falls on you. And this isn't all on you, obviously, but the numbers are still staggering. According to StatsCan, every 6 days, a woman is killed by an intimate partner in this country. When it comes to Indigenous women and girls, they are more likely to experience sexual violence than non-Indigenous women and girls. Does the issue get enough attention, do you think?
No, it's not. It's not the same, though, when I was in my 50s or 20s and 30s, that now we cannot pretend that it's an isolated situation and it's happening only over there or this place. Everybody knows, because there's a national inquiry, because there is that initiative and many movement across Canada that says enough is enough, and these are the facts. But I want to say also that, yes, intimate partner, but what we notice with the national inquiry, it is also because I'm outside, and it's not even my spouse or ex-partner, it's because I'm an Indigenous woman that I was a target. And that's, for me, it's unacceptable.
Do you think there's been progress made on that? I don't know if many Canadians were aware of that fact, except for the last few years.
Progress, hard to say, but one thing I noticed over the 30 years of being involved, or since I was born, but obviously I remember more the past 30 years, that there's a conversation that is there right now that it didn't happen before. We have a report, a national inquiry. We have the TRC also, the Truth and Reconciliation. We didn't have those reports, which is the Canadian language. We're telling you this is wrong, and this is the solution that came from grassroots families and women who think that it might save their life or the next generation of young women that are coming. So it wasn't there before. And to conclude very quickly, Joyce Echaquan, one of our sisters who left the world in circumstance that nobody should leave the world like this. Now in Quebec, we see faces or people that would sign article, op-eds that are not even Indigenous, that are walking beside us. Not for us, but beside us. And it's huge for me.
You know, it's also very interesting because in speaking with Indigenous leaders in this country, they always point out the fact that if we're on the road to conciliation, if this was a story, we're actually only in the first chapter. We're not anywhere near the end of the first chapter. We're just at the first paragraph of the first chapter. And with this organization, the Moose Hide campaign, it's not only about gender-based violence, but it's also raising the issue that the violence that they're trying to address has its roots in colonialization. Can you talk about that?
Well, as an example, when I was born, I normalized the violence. I normalized that because my mom is Innu and my dad is Québécois, that there is a wagon, and they used to call it like that on the train. This is for the savages, and this is for the white people. Until 1989. I normalized that. So for me today, I don't think we would accept that. But the beauty is that that train today, my nation owned that train. Reconciliation, but also resilience and telling people that the problem was imposed to us, the bias is still there, or the behavior, attitude, policy, and so on are still there. But because we know now, we don't want to be complicit. We want to act and change those things. So colonialism, it's not over. We're still acting in those spaces, whether we like it or not, I don't. But we understand that we need to change it. And I feel the change is happening.
Now, the Moose Hide campaign, their annual day is coming up, May the 11th.
Yes.
So a couple of weeks away. What do you hope Canadians, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, do and take a moment for on that day?
Well, to realize that maybe it's looked like very simple, but it generate conversation. We exchange, but also personally, when we wear it, it's because I commit. You know, I stand, or it's my personal responsibility. But no matter where we work, where we involve, or where we volunteer, there's always a friend that we know that is facing violence, or it's hidden or taboo. This campaign maybe could help this person to understand that there is project, programs, initiatives, services to help her or him to go away from that violent situation. So it's a responsibility, it's a protection also, but it's also something that you have to commit. You just don't wear it. You're in action. You have to do something. Well, that's what I do, full of love.
Well, I love that you took the time to speak with us today. Senator Michelle Odette, thank you very much for it.
Thank you.
And that is our program for this weekend. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. We'll see you again next time.